The train had not even stopped before the man on the platform started shouting. He was red-faced and broad-shouldered, a local cattle boss named Denton Hale, who had appointed himself the unofficial gatekeeper of Red Willow, Montana, and he had decided, before the wheels even squealed to a halt, that the woman stepping off that train did not belong here. "Send her back," he bellowed, loud enough that every person on the platform turned to look. "We don't need another helpless city woman coming out here to die on someone else's land and make the rest of us clean up the mess." The woman in question had one foot on the step and one hand gripping the rail. She was young, younger than most expected, and she carried a single worn satchel that looked like it had survived more journeys than she had. She did not flinch. She did not retreat back into the train car. She set her second foot on the platform, straightened her back, and looked at Denton Hale with the kind of stillness that only comes from someone who has already lost everything they feared losing. That was the moment Red Willow got its first real look at Eliza Marlowe. And that was the moment, though he would never admit it for months, that Caleb Whitmore stopped breathing for just a second. If you've ever watched someone stand their ground when every person around them expected them to run, subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happened next on that platform in 1882 changed two broken lives in ways neither of them ever saw coming. Caleb Whitmore had not wanted to come to town that morning. He had woken before sunrise the way he always did, dressed in the gray dark, eaten cold leftover biscuit, standing at the kitchen window, and told himself twice that he would not go. His sister Margaret had sent a letter, then another, then a third, this one delivered by hand through the minister's wife, which meant Margaret had decided embarrassment was a reasonable tool. The letter said, "The woman arrives on the Thursday train. Her name is Eliza Marlowe. She is 26, capable, and has nowhere else to go. You will meet her at the station. Caleb, I am asking you as your sister and as someone who loves you, please do not leave her standing alone on that platform." He had left the house at 8 o'clock with no intention of going anywhere near the station. He arrived at the station at 10:45, which was 4 minutes before the train. He told himself he was only there to tell her in person that there had been a mistake, that Margaret had overstepped, that he was not a man who needed a wife or wanted one or had any business taking one, and that whatever arrangement had been made by letter could be unmade by a brief and polite conversation at the platform, and then the woman could take the next train back to wherever she came from, and that would be the end of it. He had rehearsed parts of this conversation twice on the ride into town. Then the train came in and Denton Hale started shouting, and Caleb forgot every word he had planned to say. He knew Hale. Everyone in the valley knew Hale, knew the way he used his size and his volume to shrink other people, knew the way he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt like he was posing for a portrait of himself. Hale ran cattle on the land east of Caleb's property and had spent 3 years making low comments at every public occasion about how the Whitmore ranch was going to seed now that there was no one to run it properly. The comments were never direct enough to answer and always loud enough to hear. Caleb had learned to walk past them. But watching Hale shout at a woman who had just stepped off a train carrying one bag and had not yet spoken a single word, that landed differently. Eliza Marlowe did not look at Hale after that first moment. She looked at the small crowd assembled on the platform, scanning faces with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested she was not looking for sympathy, but for something specific. Her eyes found Caleb's. She held his gaze for 1 beat, 2, then walked toward him directly, as though she had known exactly which man he was. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Not a question. "Miss Marlowe." He had not planned to use her name. It came out before he could stop it. "I'm told you weren't expecting me," she said. "My sister—" "I know what your sister did." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. "I knew when I agreed to come that the arrangement wasn't your idea. I want you to know I'm not here to make demands on you. I'm here because I had a choice between 2 difficult situations, and I chose this one." She paused. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But I'd appreciate it if you'd say so now, before I've had time to get attached to the scenery." Behind them, Hale had not stopped talking. He had pivoted from general disapproval to specific commentary, telling anyone who would listen that Caleb Whitmore had sunk so low he was ordering women through the mail like seed catalogs. 2 men laughed. A woman near the depot door looked at the ground. Caleb looked at Eliza Marlowe. He looked at her worn satchel, and her straight spine, and the set of her jaw, which was the jaw of someone who had made a decision and was now waiting to find out if the decision had been worth making. "The wagon's out front," he said. "It's a long ride." She nodded once, like that was a reasonable answer, and followed him off the platform without looking back at Hale. The ride to the ranch took 2.5 hours. Caleb had not spoken to another person at length. He tried to count back and couldn't quite reach the number. Since his foreman, Pete, had left in the spring to go work his brother's land in Wyoming, there had been no one on the property but Caleb and the animals, and animals did not require conversation. He had expected Eliza to fill the silence the way he imagined city women did, with questions, with observations, with anxious chatter to cover the strangeness of the situation. She didn't. She sat on the bench beside him with her satchel in her lap and watched the land go by. The grass was tall and brown at the edges from the dry summer. The mountains in the north were already holding snow in their high creases. When a hawk dropped off a fence post and glided low over the road, she tracked it without comment until it vanished into the grass. "Have you been on a ranch before?" he asked, mostly to stop himself from noticing how quiet she was. "No," she said. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father worked for the railroad." "Then you don't know what you're walking into." "No," she agreed. "Do you want to tell me, or would you rather I find out for myself?" He didn't answer. He was trying to figure out if the question was sharp or simply honest. With her, it was genuinely hard to tell. "The place is in poor shape," he said finally. "I haven't had help since spring. The east fence line needs work, the barn roof leaks in 2 places I know of, and probably more I don't. And I lost 8 head of cattle to a sickness in August that I still can't fully explain." He didn't know why he was telling her this. He had not planned to. "I'm telling you because you should understand what you're agreeing to before you agree to anything." She considered this. "When you say the place is in poor shape," she said, "do you mean there's nothing left to save, or do you mean it's going to take work?" "Work," he said. "A lot of it." "I can work," she said simply, and then went quiet again. He had not asked her anything about herself, where she had come from before St. Louis, what her life had been, why she had agreed to answer a mail-order advertisement from a man she had never met on the far edge of Montana Territory. It was not his instinct to ask. His instinct, cultivated over 4 years of keeping the world at distance, was to know only what he needed to know, and nothing more. But somewhere in the last 10 miles before the ranch, he found himself glancing at her and trying to read the shape of a life from the evidence of a face and a pair of hands, and finding he could not do it. There was something in her expression that was closed in the same way his own was, and he recognized the architecture of someone who had learned to keep things in because letting them out had not gone well. He did not ask her about it. He told himself it was because it wasn't his business. He was not sure that was entirely true. The ranch looked worse than he had been imagining, which was an uncomfortable thing to realize when you were watching a stranger see it for the first time. He watched her take it in. The slanted fence near the gate that he had been meaning to fix since June, the barn with the patched roof that hadn't held through last month's rain, the main house with the sagging porch step that he'd been walking around for so long he'd stopped seeing it. She didn't say anything. She looked at all of it with the same measuring attention she'd given the hawk on the road. "Kitchen garden," she said after a moment. "What?" She pointed to the south side of the house. "That patch there. Nothing in it now, but the soil looks all right. Is there water access?" "Well's on that side, yes." She nodded, like she was making a note in her head. He had expected horror, or at least disappointment. He had gotten inventory. The house inside was not much better. He had kept it clean in the spare way that men alone keep things clean. Surfaces clear, floor swept, nothing decorative left out. He had packed away everything that wasn't functional after Sarah died, which meant the house felt less like a home and more like a place where practical activities occurred. He was aware of this as he opened the front door and let her in ahead of him, aware in a way he usually wasn't. "There are 2 rooms," he said. "You'll take the back one." He had moved his things to the smaller room off the kitchen 2 weeks ago, at Margaret's instruction, and then told himself he had done it for practical reasons, and not because some part of him had begun, against his will, to slightly believe this might actually happen. She walked through the front room and into the back. He waited in the hallway. He heard her set the satchel down. "It's fine," she said when she came back out. "Thank you for—" She stopped. "For what?" She looked at him for a moment. "For coming to the station," she said. "You didn't have to." He did not tell her he had almost not come. He went to put the horse up and left her standing in the kitchen, and he was halfway to the barn before he realized he had not told her where anything was. He went back. She had found the stove already and was coaxing it to life with the competence of someone who had done it many times, though she'd told him she was from St. Louis. He stood in the doorway and wondered what exactly her life had been, and then wondered why he kept coming back to that question. "Firewood's on the east side of the house," he said. "Water pump's in the yard. If you need anything from the root cellar, I'll show you tomorrow." "All right," she said, without turning around. He went back to the barn. He spent longer with the horse than he needed to. The first week was not what he had expected, and he had not expected much. He had braced himself for complaint, for a woman who would look at the mud and the cold and the relentless work and begin to calculate what it would cost to leave. He had seen it before, not in wives but in hired hands. That particular look on a man's face at the end of the second day, when the romance of frontier living had fully evaporated and what remained was only the weight of it. Eliza Marlowe did not show that look. Not in the first 3 days, not in the first week. What she did instead was study. He came in at noon the first day and found her in the root cellar making a written list of what was stored and what was missing. With a second column, he could not read upside down. The second morning, he found her at the east fence before he got there. Not fixing it yet, but walking its length with one hand trailing along the posts, checking for which ones were sound and which were rotten. By the end of the week, she had mapped the property on a piece of brown paper she'd found somewhere, not the way he would have mapped it, deed corner to deed corner, but functionally, marking water sources and sun exposure and where the drainage went wrong after rain. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, when he found the map on the kitchen table. "My father used to make me help him read survey documents when I was young," she said. He said a woman who understood land was harder to cheat. It was the most she had volunteered about her past. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He was fair to himself. He tried. He tried not to notice things about her. He tried to treat the arrangement as purely practical. There was work to be done. She was willing to do it, and the arrangement would resolve itself into whatever it was going to be without him thinking about it too hard. He tried to stay in the established grooves of his days and let her existence orbit somewhere adjacent to him without actual intersection. But she kept doing things that were hard to ignore. She found the half-broken seed press he'd put behind the barn 3 years ago and spent an afternoon with his toolbox fixing it until it worked. She rendered lard from the last of the pork stores with a patience and accuracy that suggested she had learned it somewhere specific. She stayed up past midnight 2 nights running to watch how the cold moved across the pasture, standing at the kitchen window in the dark, though she was up before him every morning. He asked her about the nights at the window. It was not the kind of thing he would usually ask. "Frost patterns," she said. "I want to understand what the soil does before I put anything in the ground." He looked at her. "You're planning to plant something?" "In spring. If there's time before the ground hardens again, I want to get some cover crop in on the south patch. It'll help next year's kitchen garden." She said it plainly, like next year was an understood fact between them, like she had already decided she would be here for it, and she was mildly surprised that this required explaining. He went to bed that night and lay with his eyes open for a long time. What? The trouble started in the 3rd week, which was when the town of Red Willow began to form opinions. It was not the whispers he had expected, not the ones about impropriety or about whether it was proper for a woman to be living unmarried in a man's house, though those existed. What hit harder was the professional doubt. The assessment, delivered by 3 different mouths in the space of 1 week, that Eliza Marlowe was going to run Caleb Whitmore's failing ranch deeper into the ground than it already was. The first was a woman named Cora Sims, wife of the owner of the feed store, who told Margaret at church that she had heard the new woman was making changes to the Whitmore property that nobody with any real sense would recommend, and that it was a shame Caleb didn't know enough to stop her. The second was a man at the mill who said it within Caleb's hearing and then looked at him directly and didn't take it back. The third was Denton Hale, who never said anything once if he could say it repeatedly, and who had apparently taken Eliza Marlowe's arrival as a personal inconvenience to be addressed by sustained public commentary. Hale told anyone who would listen that women who came from cities didn't understand soil, couldn't understand it, and that watching a railroad man's daughter try to fix a Montana ranch was like watching someone use a teacup to bail a flooding river. Caleb heard all of it. What surprised him was the degree to which it made him angry on her behalf. Not on the ranch's behalf, not on his own, but specifically hers. He said nothing to her about it. He was not sure what he would say. And then he came in one afternoon in the 4th week, mud to the knee from working the east drainage, and found her standing at the kitchen table in front of 4 jars of soil samples she had apparently collected from different parts of the property, comparing them against a hand-drawn chart she had made from a book she must have ordered, because he had never seen it in the house before. She was talking to herself, barely audible, the kind of muttering that meant she had forgotten someone else was there. He stood in the doorway and watched her move between the jars and the chart, and something about the private earnestness of it, the complete absence of performance, the total absorption of a person who was doing something because she believed it mattered, not because anyone was watching, knocked something loose in him that he was not prepared for. He cleared his throat. She looked up, not startled, just returned to the present. "Supper will be another hour," she said. "The soil samples," he said. "The north pasture's alkaline," she said, shifting back to the table. "It's why your yields have been dropping. It's not the drought alone. If we lime the soil before winter sets in—" She stopped. "I'll write it up," she said, "so you can look at it and decide." He was still standing in the doorway. "You've been doing this since the beginning," he said. "All the lists, the map, the nights at the window." She looked at him steadily. "Yes." "Why?" The question came out differently than he intended. Less practical, more something else. She seemed to hear the something else because she took a moment before she answered. "Because if I'm going to be somewhere," she said, "I want to actually understand it, not just survive in it." She looked at the jars. "Surviving is the bare minimum. I did that for 3 years in St. Louis after my mother died and my father lost the house, and I was very good at it, and I hated it." She said this without self-pity, as a fact. "I don't want to just survive here, Mr. Whitmore. I want the place to grow." He went to change out of his muddy clothes. He sat on the edge of the bed in the small room for several minutes before he moved. He was beginning to suspect that his sister had known something he hadn't. By the 5th week, the ranch had changed in small but undeniable ways. The kitchen garden patch was cleared and turned, ready for whatever Eliza planned to put in it come spring. The sagging porch step had been replaced. He had come home one afternoon to find her finishing the job with his tools, using technique that was rough but effective, which was more than the step had deserved. The east fence had been repaired in the sections that needed replacing, the ones that could be saved reinforced, and it had taken her 4 days working alongside him and 2 days working alone while he dealt with the cattle. She did not ask him to notice these things. She did not point them out. They simply occurred, one by one, with the quiet insistence of someone who had made a decision about what kind of place this was going to be. The town kept talking. Hale kept talking loudest. One afternoon he drove into town for supplies and found Hale at the feed store counter, and Hale said, with the ease of a man who had practiced the sentence, that he wondered how long it would take the city girl to realize she'd hitched herself to a dead horse. Caleb set the money on the counter. "How's your east well?" he said. Hale frowned. "What?" "Your east well, the one on the boundary. I noticed last week it looked like the casing was compromised. Figure that's your problem for the winter." He said it without heat, without looking at Hale, and collected his change. He was in the wagon before he realized he had done it, had come back at Hale, which he had not done in 3 years of Hale's running commentary, and that he had done it not for his own sake, but because he was tired of hearing Eliza Marlowe discussed by people who had spent less than 10 minutes in her presence. He drove home and did not examine the feeling further. He was getting better at examining things he did not want to examine, but some things still required distance. It was the 6th week, a Tuesday, when he came in from the far pasture near dark and found the kitchen empty, and the stove cold and no sign of Eliza anywhere in the house. He found her in the barn. She was sitting on a hay bale in the back corner with her knees drawn up and her face turned away from the lantern light, and she was not crying. He would say later that she was not crying, but she was holding herself with the particular stillness of someone who had been doing something before he walked in that she had decided to stop doing. He stood in the barn doorway. The horses shifted in their stalls. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "I'm all right," she said. Her voice was even. It was the voice of someone who had said, "I'm all right" enough times that it had become a reflex rather than a report. "What happened?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I got a letter today, from my cousin in St. Louis." She paused. My father died in October. I only just found out. He had not known her father was still living. He had not thought to ask. He realized now, standing in the doorway of his own barn on a cold evening, that there was a great deal about Eliza Marlowe he had chosen not to know, and he was beginning to feel the weight of that choice. He went and sat on the hay bale across from her. Not next to her. Across, at a respectful distance, with the lantern between them. I'm sorry, he said. We weren't close, she said. After he lost the house, things between us were complicated, but he was... She stopped. He was still my father. Yes, he said. That was all. He did not try to improve upon the moment or fill it with reassurance. He sat with her in this cold barn while the horses breathed and the wind moved against the roof, and after a while she straightened her back and said she'd better get supper started. He said he would take care of the stove if she wanted more time. She looked at him then, really looked at him, the same way she'd looked at him on the platform that first day, directly and without the usual deflection people put between themselves and each other when they didn't know what they were feeling. And he did not look away. Thank you, she said. It was not a social courtesy. It was a real thing she was saying. He went to the house and built the fire in the stove. He stood in the kitchen for a while, doing nothing in particular, looking at the soil sample jars still lined up on the table, and the hand-drawn chart, and the worn book she'd ordered from somewhere. And he thought about what she had said. I want the place to grow. He thought about his wife Sarah, who had wanted the same thing and who had not had enough time to make it happen, and about the boy they had lost before he could walk, and about the 4 years since then during which Caleb had done nothing with the ranch except keep it from dying, which was not the same as keeping it alive. He was still standing there when Eliza came in from the barn. She looked at the stove, already lit. She looked at him. You said you'd take care of the stove, she said. I did, he said. She walked past him to wash her hands at the basin. He heard her exhale. Not a sigh. Something quieter than that. More like the sound of a person who has been holding tension in their shoulders for a very long time and has briefly, temporarily, let some of it go. He went to set the table. It was the first time he had done it without thinking. He woke at 2 a.m. to the smell of smoke. Not the normal smoke of the banked stove. Something different. The chemical sharp of something that shouldn't be burning. He was out of bed and in the hall before he was fully awake, and he saw the orange flicker coming from under the kitchen door and understood immediately that the stove had thrown a spark, or the chimney had malfunctioned and the kitchen was on fire. He pushed open the door. It was the wall beside the chimney, a section where the plaster had cracked last winter and he had patched it badly or not enough, and now it was black and burning at the edges. Not the catastrophic fire he had feared for half a second, but moving fast enough to matter. He was reaching for the water bucket when he heard her already filling it at the pump. He had not heard her wake up, had not heard her come through the house. But Eliza Marlowe was at the pump in the dark, filling the bucket with the quick, efficient movements of someone who had assessed the situation and selected the correct action, and she handed it to him without a word and went back to fill the second one. They put it out in 4 minutes. The wall was charred in a section 2 feet square, the plaster ruined, but the structure was intact and the fire was out, and they stood in the kitchen in the gray smoke smell, both breathing hard, both covered in the kind of practical mess that comes from putting a fire out quickly. He looked at the damaged wall. He looked at her. Thank you, he said. You would have caught it, she said. But she was looking at the wall with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not fear exactly, but the aftershock of fear, the body coming down from the high wire of emergency back to the ordinary ground. Are you hurt? No. She looked at her hands. Her palms were red from the pump handle in the cold. No, I'm fine. He got the salve from the cabinet and put it on the table without saying anything. She looked at it. She looked at him. Then she sat down at the table and applied it herself, and he made up the stove for warmth because the kitchen had gone cold from the pump water and the open door, and they sat in the rebuilt warmth of the stove for a while without speaking. Outside, the wind came down from the north the way it did when the temperature was about to drop. The winter's going to be hard, he said. Yes, she said. Harder than you're expecting, probably. She looked at the charred wall. Harder than I'm expecting, she repeated, like she was testing the weight of it. Then, but not impossible. He looked at the wall, too. at the damage and the mess and the work it was going to take to repair it. Then he looked at the jars of soil samples and the chart and the book, still where she had left them, unhurt. No, he said, not impossible. The wind hit the north wall of the house and moved on. The stove settled. Outside in the barn, one of the horses shifted in its sleep, and the sound came faintly through the dark, familiar as a heartbeat. Neither of them moved to go back to bed for a while. And that was the night Caleb Whitmore stopped thinking of Eliza Marlowe as an arrangement that had been made without his consent, and started, in the slow and careful way of someone who had nearly forgotten how, to think of her as someone who was here. The morning after the fire, Caleb repaired the wall. He did not wait for a better day or make a list of what he needed first. He got up before light, assessed the damage in the early gray, and started pulling the ruined plaster off with a pry bar while the coffee was still brewing. It was the kind of work he understood, direct, physical, with a clear before and a clear after. And he moved through it with the focused economy of a man who had been doing hard things alone long enough that he had stopped thinking of them as hard. Eliza came in at 6:30 and did not comment on the fact that he was already mid-repair. She made breakfast, set a plate at the work table near where he was working, and poured a second cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. He noticed she had put in less sugar than he usually took, which meant she had been paying attention to how he took it and had remembered it imperfectly, which somehow struck him as more honest than if she had gotten it exactly right. He ate without stopping work. She ate at the table. Neither of them mentioned the previous night directly. Not the fire, not the hour they had sat together afterward, not the strange quiet that had settled over the kitchen in the aftermath, which had not felt like the quiet of two strangers, but something else, something neither of them had named. By mid-morning, the wall was replastered. It would need another day to cure before paint, but the structure was sound. He cleaned his tools while she washed the breakfast dishes, and he thought, briefly, in passing, that there was something almost domestic about the scene, and then immediately thought about something else. "The north pasture fence," he said, putting the tools away. "What about it?" "The section I haven't gotten to yet. It needs to be done before the hard freeze." "I can help," she said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to." She was drying a pot. "Do you want help or not?" He looked at her. She looked at him with the patient, slightly blunt expression of someone waiting for an answer to a straightforward question. He said yes, and they spent the afternoon on the north fence line in the cutting November wind, working without much conversation, and the fence got done. That was how the second month began. Not with anything announced or decided, but with the quiet and gradually undeniable fact that they had started to function as a unit. It was imperfect. Most things between them were still imperfect. He was not a man who had ever found it easy to speak about ordinary things, and the habit of silence he had built over 4 years was not dismantled quickly. There were evenings he sat at the table after supper with nothing to say, and the awareness that he probably should have something, and the gap between those two facts sat between them like a physical object. She did not try to fill the gap. Sometimes he appreciated that. Sometimes, on the harder evenings, he found himself wishing she would. She had her own version of the same problem. He noticed it, the way she would start to say something and then recalibrate, pull it back, offer a smaller and safer version of whatever the original thought had been. He recognized it because he did the same thing. He had learned it after Sarah died, that particular discipline of editing yourself down to what seemed safe to share, and seeing it in Eliza made him wonder what had taught it to her. He still had not asked. The town of Red Willow was a small place in the specific way that frontier towns were small, not just in size, but in the way information moved through it, which was quickly and thoroughly and without much concern for accuracy. By the 7th week of Eliza's presence on the Whitmore ranch, everyone in the valley had an opinion about her, and almost none of them had spent more than 10 minutes in her company. The women of the town were divided. Some were wary. She was an outsider with no family connection to anyone in the territory, no history here, no roots. Others were curious in a more generous way, the curiosity of people who recognized a woman trying to build something and were not entirely unsympathetic, even if they kept the sympathy quiet in public. The men were almost uniformly skeptical, which was the predictable position of men who had decided what a woman from a city was capable of before she had demonstrated anything. Denton Hale remained the loudest voice, and he had recently acquired an audience. His two hired hands echoed him at the saloon. The miller's son, who had ambitions of purchasing the east section of Caleb's land if the ranch failed, had begun making remarks at the general store about the timing of things, about how a struggling property with a strange woman running changes on it was likely to fold before spring. Caleb heard all of it. He absorbed it with the same set jaw he brought to most unpleasant things, and he said nothing. Eliza heard some of it. The first time was in the third week of November, when she drove the wagon into town alone for the first time to pick up supplies Caleb had ordered. She came back quieter than she had left, and she put the supplies away with an efficiency that had a specific controlled quality to it, the quality of someone directing energy away from something they did not want to feel. He was in the barn when she came to find him. A woman named Cora Sims told me, she said without preamble, that the last woman who tried to make something of rocky soil in this valley had to be carried off the property in the spring. She told me this as advice. He kept his hands on the harness he was mending. Cora Sims has been waiting for this ranch to fail since her husband made an offer on the water rights 3 years ago. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you sell? Because the water rights are the only reason the east pasture is worth anything. Oh, she was processing this. So she's not just gossiping, she has a reason. Most people's gossip has a reason, he said. Doesn't make it true. She looked at him for a moment. You know things about this valley that I don't. Yes. Will you tell me them? He put the harness down and looked at her straight. She was serious, not defensive, not rattled by what Cora Sims had said. She had already moved past the sting of it and was working toward the practical question underneath, which was, what do I need to understand about where I am? He told her. He sat on the workbench and told her about the Sims and the water rights and the history of the property and the relationships between the families in the valley in the specific, unsentimental way he understood them. Who wanted what? Who owed whom? Where the fault lines ran. He talked for nearly an hour, which was more than he had talked in a single sitting since he could remember, and she listened without interrupting except to ask specific questions when she needed to. When he finished, she said, Hale wants the east pasture. Hale wants everything that borders him, Caleb said. He's been buying up land for 6 years. He'll get to mine eventually, if I give him a reason. Then we shouldn't give him a reason, she said. She said we. He noticed it. He was not sure she had. December arrived with the particular ferocity that Montana reserves for people who have not yet learned to take it seriously. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 days. The wind came in from the northwest and stayed. The cattle needed more tending, which meant more time outside in conditions that had gone from difficult to punishing, and the daily work of the ranch expanded to fill every available hour of daylight, and then some. Caleb had wintered alone for 4 years. He had a system established through trial and significant error, and the system worked well enough. He moved through the cold with the grim efficiency of someone who had no alternative, and he kept the livestock alive and the pipes from freezing and the firewood stocked, and that was winter. That was what winter was. Eliza inserted herself into the system without dismantling it, which was the thing he had feared she would do, come in with city ideas and rearrange things in ways that would cause problems he would have to fix. She didn't. She watched his system for the first week and then asked questions about the parts she didn't understand, and then she started filling in the edges of it, the places where the system had gaps because one person couldn't cover everything at once. She started getting up earlier. He did not ask her to. One morning he came into the kitchen at 5 and she was already dressed and had the stove going and was making a list of what needed to happen before the light came. And he looked at her and said, You don't have to. I know, she said. We'll get more done before dark if I do. You'll wear yourself out. So will you. She handed him the coffee. We can wear ourselves out together. He did not have an answer for that. He took the coffee. They developed a pattern. He took the far pasture in the early hours while she handled the barn and the closer animals. They met in the middle for the feeding, worked the fence where it needed attention, and were back inside by early afternoon to deal with the household work before dark. It was exhausting in the bone-deep, cumulative way that winter ranch work was always exhausting, and there were days he came in so tired he could barely sit through supper, and he suspected she felt the same, though she rarely showed it. One evening in the middle of December, he came in to find her asleep in the kitchen chair, her head tipped against the wall, her hand still holding the mending she'd been working on. She had fallen asleep mid-stitch. The fire was still going. The house was warm. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her the way he had not let himself look at her in the daytime. Honestly, without the performance of neutrality he had been maintaining. She looked younger when she was asleep. She looked like someone who had been tired for a long time and had finally, briefly, stopped fighting it. He took the mending from her hands without waking her. He put it on the table. He went to get her coat from the hook and draped it over her shoulders, and she stirred but didn't wake, just settled further into the chair with a small, unconscious exhale, and he went to bed and did not sleep immediately. He thought about the way she'd said we can wear ourselves out together, and the matter-of-fact way she'd handed him the coffee, and the soil sample jars still on the table, and the fact that she had been asleep in his kitchen chair in the middle of winter, looking like she had simply decided this was where she belonged. He thought about Sarah. He did this carefully, the way you probe a healing wound to see if it still hurts, and it did. It always did. But the quality of the pain had changed. It was not the acute, breathless thing it had been in the first year, the kind that ambushed you in doorways and at the kitchen table and made the ordinary world look like a foreign country. It had become something he carried rather than something that carried him. He was not sure exactly when that had happened. He suspected it had something to do with having someone else in the house. He did not fully examine that suspicion. Not yet. The crisis came in the third week of December, as crises in Montana winters often do, suddenly, with no warning, at the worst possible time. I was checking the north herd when he found 3 cattle down, not dead, not yet, but down. And the way they were lying, the labored breath, the slack look in their eyes, told him immediately what it was. He had seen it before. The sickness that had taken 8 head in August had come back, or had never fully left, and now it was moving through the north herd with the efficiency of something that had learned where the weaknesses were. He got the sick animals separated and into the far pen, and was back in the barn assessing the rest of the herd when Eliza came to find him. He did not know how she knew. She simply appeared, the way she had started simply appearing when something went wrong, with her coat buttoned wrong and her hair only half pinned because she had moved fast. "How many?" she said. 3 down. 7 more showing early signs, maybe. He was checking eyes, checking breath, doing the grim arithmetic of how far this had gotten before he caught it. "It's the same sickness from August." "What did you do for it in August?" "Lost 8 head," he said flatly. She absorbed this. "What did you try?" He told her. She listened, and then she went to the house and came back with the book. The one she had ordered, the one about soil, which apparently was also about other things because she had it open to a section he had not looked at. And she said, "There's a rancher in the valley. The one you mentioned, Garner, with the place near the creek. You said he's been running cattle for 30 years. Since before the territory was settled, yes. Has he seen this sickness before?" "I don't know. Would he talk to you about it?" Caleb looked at her. "I haven't spoken to Garner in 2 years." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "We had a disagreement about a fence line." "Is the disagreement worth 8 cattle?" He did not answer. He looked at the sick animals and then at Eliza, who was looking back at him without judgment, but with the flat, serious expression of someone who had done the math and was waiting for him to do it too. He drove to Garner's place that afternoon. It was not an easy drive, and it was not an easy conversation, and the fence line disagreement was still sitting between them like a third person at the table. But Garner was a man who had been ranching long enough to separate personal grievance from cattle sickness, and he talked. He told Caleb what he knew, a treatment he'd used once, years ago, that had worked on something that sounded the same. He wrote it down on a piece of paper in his careful old man handwriting and handed it over without ceremony. When Caleb got back, Eliza had already organized the sick pen and was keeping the animals warm. He showed her the paper. She read it twice. She said, "We'll need to get to town for 2 of these." "I'll go in the morning." "Go tonight," she said. "If this moves the way August moved." "Tonight," he agreed. He drove into Red Willow in the dark and the cold, got what he needed from the store. The owner's wife answered the back door in her nightclothes without complaint because ranchers in winter emergencies were not unusual, and drove back. They worked through most of the night. Eliza did not ask him to share the work. She simply did half of it, moving between the animals with a calm and methodical attention that did not waver even at 2 in the morning when they were both past exhausted. By dawn they had treated all 7 of the early cases. The 3 who had been fully down were harder. One of them they lost by mid-morning, and Caleb stood at the gate of the pen for a while after, saying nothing. Eliza came to stand beside him, not close enough to touch, just present. "I'm sorry," she said. "One's better than 8, he said. "Yes." A pause. "It is." He drove the animal out to the far field later. When he came back, she had made soup from the last of the stored vegetables, and the kitchen was warm, and she had not asked him how he was feeling about it because she seemed to understand that he was not a person who answered that question well when asked directly. He sat down at the table. She put the soup in front of him. He ate most of it before he said, "You were right about going to Garner." "You went," she said. "That's what mattered." "We would have lost more." "Maybe." She sat down across from him. "Or maybe you would have figured something else out. You did manage this ranch alone for 4 years." "I wasn't managing it," he said before he thought about it. "I was just keeping it from dying." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a difference," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to remember what it is." She looked at him. He looked at his soup. But the silence after that was different from the silences they had sat in before. Less like an absence and more like a room where something had just been said that had weight. The week between Christmas and the New Year was the strangest stretch of time Caleb had experienced in recent memory, which was saying something. Margaret came to visit. This had been announced in a letter 2 weeks prior, which gave him enough time to dread it thoroughly. Margaret was 4 years older than him, had been married for 20 years to a steady man in Billings, had 3 children, and possessed the particular combination of genuine warmth and relentless practicality that had made her the person who, when she believed her brother was destroying himself with loneliness, had taken it upon herself to arrange a solution without consulting him. She arrived on the 26th in a hired buggy, walked into the house, hugged Caleb in the brief and businesslike way she always hugged him, and then turned to Eliza and hugged her differently, longer, with both arms, the hug of someone who has been worried about a person they have never met. He watched Eliza's face during that hug. She looked startled. And then, for just a second, she looked like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have someone be glad to see them. Margaret stayed 4 days. In 4 days, she assessed the state of the kitchen garden plans, inspected the repaired wall, asked pointed questions about the cattle sickness and the treatment, met Caleb's eyes over Eliza's shoulder at dinner in a way that communicated a very specific kind of satisfied I told you so without a word, and talked to Eliza in the evenings about everything from preserving techniques to the political situation in the eastern cities in the tone of a woman who had decided Eliza was someone worth talking to. On the 3rd night, when Eliza had gone to bed early from exhaustion, Margaret sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table with her tea and said, "She's remarkable, Caleb." "She works hard," he said. "That's not what I said." He looked at his hands. "Margaret." "I'm not pushing," she said, which was not entirely true. "I'm observing. There's a difference." She drank her tea. "She's had a harder life than she lets on, I think." "Yes," he said. "Ed, do you know much about it?" "No." A pause. "Not yet." Margaret looked at him. The not yet had come out without him planning it, and he was aware she had heard exactly what it meant, and he was also aware that he had meant it. "All right," Margaret said. She did not make more of it than that. It was one of the better qualities she had. After she left, the house felt quiet in a way that was different from before. Not empty. He had noticed it was getting harder to think of the house as empty, the way it used to be. But still. Settled. Like a place that had taken something in and adjusted around it. January arrived and the cold deepened, and the ranch entered the stretch that tested everything. It was during this time that Eliza started doing something he hadn't expected. In the evenings, after the work was done and the animals were settled, she began writing. Not letters. She wrote those on Sunday mornings, quick and private, addressed to her cousin in St. Louis. This was different. She sat at the table with a ledger he hadn't seen before and wrote in it with the focused attention she brought to everything. He asked her about it one evening when he came in and found her at it. "Records," she said. "What we treated the cattle with, what worked, what the soil samples showed, what the weather did. So next year we don't have to start from scratch." He looked at the ledger. It was dense with small, neat writing and hand-drawn diagrams of the pasture sections and notes on temperature and dates. It was the most thorough documentation of the ranch's conditions he had ever seen. No one's ever kept records like this, he said. Then no one could ever learn from one year to the next, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the ledger, not at him. Eliza, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked up. This is good work, he said. What you're building here. The records, the soil work, the system. He stopped. He was not practiced at this. I want you to know I see it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Caleb. She said it simply, without elaboration. But she said his name too, which meant they had crossed some invisible line between them without discussing it, and both of them knew it, and neither of them mentioned it, and the evening went on. Outside, the snow came down in the patient, in different way it did in Montana in January. Not a storm, just the steady accumulation of a world going about its business. And inside the house, the lamp burned and the stove held its heat, and the ledger filled up with another page of everything they were learning together about how to keep a piece of land alive. The woman who had arrived with one worn satchel and a fragile hope was no longer arriving. She was here. She had been here for a while now, and the man who had told himself, all the way to the station that first morning, that he was only going to tell her there had been a mistake. That man was beginning to understand, slowly and against every defensive instinct he had developed over 4 years of protecting himself from exactly this, that the mistake might have been everything he had believed before she stepped off the train. He did not say any of this. He was not ready to say it, but he stopped pretending he didn't think it, and for now that was enough. The ledger became the thing that held them together through February. Not the only thing. There was the work, always the work, and the particular rhythm they had developed through the cattle sickness and the fire and the long weeks of January cold. But the ledger was where it showed most clearly. Eliza added to it every evening. Caleb had started reading it. He didn't tell her he was reading it. He would pick it up in the mornings before she was up, sit at the table with his coffee, and go through what she had written the night before. The entries were factual and precise, but not cold. She had a way of noting things that was efficient without being stripped of feeling. The way she'd written about the cattle they lost, for instance, was one sentence, but it was the right sentence, the one that held the actual weight of the loss without dramatizing it. He recognized that quality. It was the same instinct he had, the instinct to not perform grief, but to simply account for it honestly. He put the ledger back where she kept it each morning before she came out. She never mentioned that she noticed him doing this, and he never mentioned it either, and it was one of several things between them that existed clearly and went unspoken. The cold in February was different from January's cold. January had been consistent, brutal, and steady, the kind of weather you learned the shape of and made your plans around. February came in with variability, which was worse. 2 days of relative warmth that softened the ground and got the cattle moving, followed by a plunge that refroze everything with a skim of ice over the mud. A week of that kind of weather made the daily work unpredictable in ways that wore on a person differently than straightforward hardship. One morning, the water pump froze solid despite the wrapping they'd put around it in November. Caleb was working the casing free with hot water when Eliza came out and found him at it, and she took over the pouring without being asked while he worked the handle, and they got it running in about 20 minutes, and neither of them had said a word. He had started to notice these moments, the ones that unfolded without any planning or discussion, where they simply moved around each other with a kind of efficiency that should not have existed yet between two people who had met 4 months ago and had started as strangers on a train platform. He did not know what to call it. He was not trying very hard to name it. He was trying to keep a ranch alive in February in Montana, which was enough to occupy the front of a person's mind, and he had learned, at some cost, that the things in the back of a person's mind had a way of waiting for you. It was Hale who brought things to a head, which in retrospect was not surprising. Hale had been building toward something since October. The first sign was in early February, when Caleb drove into Red Willow for supplies and found that 2 of his regular orders had been redirected. The feed he ordered through the mill had been given to someone else. A clerical error, the miller's son said, with the particular blandness of a person delivering a message on behalf of someone else. The fencing wire he had ordered from the hardware store had similarly disappeared, replaced on the ledger with a note that said the order had been canceled, which Caleb had not done. He did not confront Hale directly. He drove to 3 other suppliers in the county and made alternative arrangements, which took most of a day he did not have and cost more than it should have. When he got home that evening and told Eliza what had happened, she sat very still for a moment. He's trying to slow you down, she said. Yes. Because if the spring planting is delayed, the east pasture doesn't produce, and I miss a payment on the property loan I took out 2 years ago. He said it flatly. He knows the timeline. Hale's done this before to other properties. Not this directly, but the same idea. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, not panicking, not catastrophizing, but actually working through the problem the way she worked through everything, looking for what was underneath it. Who holds the loan? She said. Bank in Miles City. Man named Aldrich. Have you met him? Once, when I took the loan. Is he an honest man? Caleb thought about it. As far as I know. Then the loan itself isn't the problem, she said. The problem is the spring production. If we can make the east pasture produce what we need it to produce by June, the payment is manageable? Yes, if. She got up and took the ledger from the shelf. She opened it to the section where she had been charting the east pasture, its soil composition, its drainage patterns, what it had produced in the past and why, what it might produce with amendment. She had 4 pages of notes on it. She turned them toward him. I've been thinking about this for 2 months, she said. The east pasture's problem isn't the soil quality fundamentally, it's the drainage. The water is sitting too long after rain and then draining wrong when it does go. If we cut a channel here, she pointed at her hand-drawn map, and here, and put the saved fencing wire to use redirecting where the cattle graze in the wet season, we open up acreage we haven't been using effectively. She looked at him. How much of the fencing wire did you manage to source today? He told her. She nodded, calculating. It might be enough, she said. If we do the drainage first. That's 3 weeks of work before we can even start planting. Then we start the drainage tomorrow, she said. He looked at her. He looked at the 4 pages of notes she had made over 2 months, quietly, without telling him she was planning anything, just accumulating knowledge the way she accumulated everything, with patience and without announcement. You've been working on this since January, he said. Since December, actually. She closed the ledger. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure it was right. I'm still not completely sure, but it's the best option we have. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the February wind came against the side of the house and moved on. He thought about what it meant that she had spent 2 months solving a problem he didn't know they had yet, and what it meant that when he found out, her first instinct had been to show him the work and ask for his judgment rather than simply announce the solution. We start the drainage tomorrow, he said. She nodded and put the ledger back on the shelf. The drainage work was hard in the way that late winter groundwork was always hard. The soil alternately frozen and mud, the days short, the wind consistent and indifferent. They worked it in sections, Caleb cutting the primary channel with the spade, while Eliza cleared the secondary lines and shored up the edges with stone from the creek bed that she'd been collecting in a pile since November, which told him she'd known this project was coming before she'd said a word about it. On the 4th day of the drainage work, they had a visitor. He was an older man, white-haired and deliberate in his movements, who arrived on a good horse and introduced himself as Emmett Garner, the same Garner Caleb had gone to during the cattle sickness, the one with whom he'd had the fence line disagreement 2 years prior. Garner dismounted, looked at the drainage work in progress, and said, without greeting, "That's the right call." "I know," Caleb said. "Whose idea?" Caleb glanced at Eliza, who was 20 feet away moving stone. "Hers," he said. Garner looked at Eliza for a moment with the assessing expression of a man who had been reading Land and People for 30 years. "She know what she's doing?" "Generally, yes." Garner nodded slowly. "I came to tell you something," he said. "Hale was at the county office last week. He's been asking about the status of your property loan, talking to people about whether the ranch is a going concern." He said it without embellishment. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because I think you should know what's moving." Caleb was still. "Who else has he talked to?" "The miller. Maybe Aldrich's clerk in Miles City. I'm not certain of that one." Garner looked at the east pasture. "If you can show production by summer, it doesn't matter what Hale says to who. A working ranch speaks for itself." He paused. "The fence line thing. I should have handled it differently." Caleb looked at him. "So should I." They stood for a moment in the way of two stubborn men who have just exchanged the smallest possible acknowledgement of fault and are both quietly relieved to have it done with. Garner got back on his horse. "My south herd could use the east route in June if you get the pasture opened," he said. "I'd pay fair rate." It was an offer and a vote of confidence compressed into one sentence. Caleb said, "I'll let you know by April." Garner nodded and rode back out the way he'd come. Eliza had come to stand beside Caleb. She had heard the last part of it. "He'd pay to run cattle through?" she said. "If we get the pasture producing, which is what you said." She looked out at the east pasture, muddy, channeled, halfway through a transformation that was not yet visible from any distance. "April is soon," she said. "Yes," he said. "We'd better not waste the afternoon." She picked up her shovel. Duck. March came in cold and went out colder, which was Montana's way of reminding you that the calendar was a human invention and the land did not consult it. It was in the second week of March that the storm hit. He woke to a sound he had heard before, the specific low moan of the wind when it had found a sustained direction and committed to it, which was different from ordinary February gusting and meant something larger was building. He was out of bed and dressed before the first pale light. By the time he got to the barn, the snow was already horizontal, and the temperature had dropped so fast that the thermometer on the barn door had ice on its glass. He got the animals secured and was heading back to the house when he saw the section of the newly dug drainage channel, the longest segment, the one they'd finished just 4 days ago, collapse under the weight of the accumulating snow and the frozen ground heaving. 3 days of work opened up and caved in, the stone shoring Eliza had placed undermined by the freeze. He stood in the snow and looked at it for a moment. The wind was loud enough that thinking clearly took effort. He went inside. Eliza was up, dressed, standing at this kitchen window watching the storm with the specific focused expression she wore when she was making calculations. "The east drainage channel," he said. "I know, I saw it go." She turned from the window. "How bad?" "The long segment, maybe 30 feet. She was quiet for a moment. "If it's still collapsed when the thaw comes, the water will pool wrong and we lose what we planned for the east pasture this season." She sat down at the table. He sat across from her. The storm hit the north wall and the windows shook in a way that was unpleasant but held. "We can't fix it until it stops," he said. "And then the ground will be frozen harder than before." "What do we need to reopen it?" "More hands than we have." She looked at him. He looked at her. The same thought arrived in both of them at the same moment, which he could tell by the way her eyes moved. "Garner," she said. "He offered goodwill," Caleb said. "I don't know if he offered labor." "You could ask." He thought about asking Garner for help. He thought about what it would cost him, not in money, but in the harder currency of a man who had spent 4 years making a point of needing nothing from anyone. He thought about the east pasture and the loan payment and Hale at the county office making inquiries. He thought about Eliza's 4 pages of notes in the ledger. "I'll write out when the worst of this passes," he said. She nodded. Then, "The Denner family, east of town near the creek. They're not connected to Hale's network, are they?" He thought about it. "No. Old man Denner sold Hale a parcel 3 years ago and hasn't had much to do with him since. I met his wife at the store in November. She was one of the few people in Red Willow who spoke to me like a person." She said this without bitterness, just as information. "If Garner can bring one man and Denner can bring one, that's 5 of us on the channel." He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about everything that could go wrong with the east pasture," she said. "I've been thinking about it for months. I just didn't expect it to go wrong all at once." The storm ran 2 days. He spent them doing what could be done inside. Repairs, maintenance, the endless small work of a ranch in winter. And Eliza spent them doing something he did not fully notice until the second afternoon, when he realized she had been in the back room for 3 hours and went to check. She had the ledger open on the bed and was writing in it, but she also had a second document, one he hadn't seen, a formal, organized account of everything wrong with the east pasture and exactly what the plan to fix it was, written in the kind of clear and structured prose that would make sense to someone who had never seen the land. It was the kind of document you showed to a banker. He stood in the doorway. "What is that?" he said. She looked up. She had the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they weren't trying to hide but hadn't announced either. If Hale has been talking to Aldrich's people, she said, then the bank needs to see that this ranch has a plan, a written plan, not just that we're trying. She looked at the document. I've been thinking about it since Garner came. He looked at the pages. You didn't tell me. I wasn't sure you'd want me to. She said it directly. It's your ranch, your loan, your reputation with the bank. I didn't want to assume it's your drainage system, he said, your soil charts, your 4 months of records. He stopped. He looked at the document. Can I read it? She handed it to him without ceremony. He sat on the edge of the bed and read it. It took a while because it was thorough. Not just what they were doing, but why. Not just the spring plan, but the 2-year projection she'd built from her ledger records, complete with numbers he recognized from their tallies and numbers she'd extrapolated from the soil work. When he finished, he looked at her. You put together a 2-year projection, he said. It's approximate. It's more than I've had in 4 years. He looked at the pages again. You know how to do this. Write something like this. She was quiet for a moment. My father's railroad work. Before the house. He used to bring documents home and make me read them because he said it was the most important skill a person could have, understanding what the numbers were really saying. She folded her hands. I've been wanting to tell you something about my father, about why I left St. Louis. He set the document on the bed and waited. After my mother died, she said, and after he lost the house, my father made some decisions about money that weren't good ones. He borrowed from people he shouldn't have borrowed from, and when he couldn't pay, they found other ways to collect. She was looking at the window. I worked for 3 years to cover what he owed, and when he died in October, I found out that there was more debt I didn't know about, and his cousin, the one who wrote me the letter, is dealing with it now. She paused. I tell you this because you've been honest with me about the ranch's situation, and you deserve to understand why I care so much about documentation and numbers. I watched what happens when you don't have records, when there's nothing written down and someone decides to rewrite the terms. He looked at her. The storm outside had quieted to a steady fall. The room was cold, but not unbearable. Is there anything you need, he said carefully, to settle what your father owed? She shook her head. The cousin has it. It's manageable now. She looked at him. I'm not telling you because I need something. I'm telling you because I've been keeping it, and I didn't want to keep it anymore. He nodded. He thought about all the things he had been keeping, and about the way she had said I didn't want to keep it anymore, and about how he understood that feeling precisely, and had not been doing as well with it as she had. After Sarah died, he said, and it was the first time he had said her name in conversation, in this house, since it had been his wife's house too. I stopped keeping records of anything. I couldn't. He looked at his hands. The ledger she had, the household accounts, the ranch accounts, I burned it. Eliza was very still. I don't say that as something I'm proud of, he said. I say it because it explains why there's nothing before this year, why I've been running on memory and instinct for 4 years. It's not a good way to run a ranch. No, she said quietly. But it's a way a person survives when they're trying not to feel anything. He looked at her. She was not offering this as absolution or as analysis. She was simply acknowledging it, the way she acknowledged most things, directly and without embellishment. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it was. The storm finished itself by morning. He rode to Garner's place the following day, and the conversation was brief and to the point in the way of men who have already negotiated past their pride once and find it easier the second time. Garner said he could spare his foreman for 2 days and would come himself for 1. Caleb drove to the Denner place that afternoon. Old man Denner was in his 60s, slow-moving but with hands that had 30 years of ranch work in them, and his son Ira was 20 and eager in the uncomplicated way of young men who haven't yet had enough things go wrong. Denner said he'd come and bring Ira, and he said it the way country people offered help, simply, without making anything of it, as if the offer were so obvious it barely needed saying. 5 people on the channel, starting Monday, weather permitting. When Caleb got home that evening and told Eliza she was at the stove, she turned around when he came in. Garner, she said, and the Denners. She let out a breath. Not loud, not dramatic, just the kind of exhale that comes when you've been holding a specific tension and it releases. Monday? Monday. She turned back to the stove. He took off his coat and hung it up, and he was washing his hands at the basin when she said, without turning around, "You didn't have to go to 2 places." "I know," he said, "but your math was right. 5 is better than 3. She didn't say anything else, but when she put supper on the table, she had made the good biscuits, the ones that required more time and effort than the usual kind, the ones she made when there was something to mark. He ate 2 of them and did not comment on it. Some things were communicated best without comment. The work on the channel took 3 days. It was physical work of the uncomplicated kind that Caleb had always understood best: digging, placing stone, shoring, testing, and having Garner's foreman there, a taciturn man named Felix, who had been doing exactly this kind of work for 20 years, meant the technical decisions went faster and with more confidence. Old Man Denner knew drainage. Ira Denner worked without stopping and without complaint, which was the most you could ask of a 20-year-old in cold mud. Eliza fed all of them. She had prepared for 3 days of 5 workers the way she prepared for everything, ahead of time, in detail, without making a show of it. There was food at noon and food at dusk and coffee throughout, and after the first day Felix told Garner, loud enough to carry, that he didn't know what Whitmore had been doing running this place alone, and Garner said something that Caleb didn't quite catch, but which made Felix nod. On the 3rd afternoon, when the channel was restored and improved, better, actually, than the first version, because Felix had pointed out a modification that changed the angle of the primary flow. Garner stood at the edge of the east pasture and looked at it for a long time. "You'll have good production here by July if the spring is reasonable," he said. "That's what we're counting on," Caleb said. Garner looked at the channel, at the pasture, at the work. He looked at Eliza, who was talking to Ira Denner about something, showing him a page from the ledger she'd carried out. "The woman knows what she's doing," he said, which was the longest sentence Garner had ever produced on the subject. "Yes," Caleb said. "She does." Garner left. The Denners left. Felix left. The property went quiet with the specific quality of a place where significant work has just been done, and the evidence of it is visible everywhere you look. Caleb stood at the edge of the east pasture. The channel ran clear and clean, cold but would not be for much longer. In 6 weeks, the first real thaw would come, and the drainage would either work or it wouldn't, but he believed it would work, and that was a different relationship with belief than he'd had for a long time. Eliza came to stand beside him. She had a smear of mud on her cheek that she didn't know about. He thought about telling her and then didn't. "It looks different," she said, looking at the pasture. "It is different. 3 months of work and we're still just getting to the thing that matters." She said it not as a complaint, but as an observation, with the faint air of someone who has learned to accept the ratio of effort to result. "The thing that matters is usually 3 months of work away," he said. She looked at him. It was one of the more personal things he had said to her in the 6 months she had been there, which was not because it was a grand statement, but because it was true and came from somewhere in him that was not the defended surface. She looked back at the pasture. "I want to put in the cover crop this week, before the next cold spell." "I thought as much. I'll need you to turn the north section while I do the south." "All right." She started walking back toward the barn. He fell into step beside her. He had spent 4 years walking alone from one part of this property to another, and the difference between that and this, 2 people walking the same ground without it requiring any commentary, was not a large thing in the way of dramatic gestures or announced feelings, but it was real, and it was his, and he carried it in his chest on the walk back to the barn in the same careful way he carried anything that mattered. That night, after supper, he went to the barn for a last check of the animals. He took longer than usual. When he came back, the kitchen was dark and Eliza had gone to bed, but the ledger was on the table and it was open to that evening's entry, which was, he knew, because he checked now without pretending he didn't, a description of the drainage work completed, the names of the men who had helped, the state of the east pasture, and what came next. At the bottom of the page, in smaller writing that was different from her usual entries, more careful, the writing of someone making a note to themselves rather than a record for the ranch, it said, "We did something today that I didn't think was possible in March. Starting to understand that possible is a moving target here." He closed the ledger. He turned off the lamp. He stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, thinking about what it meant to have someone in a place with you who kept track of things that mattered, who wrote down not just what happened, but what it meant, who had come here with one worn satchel and turned out to be, underneath everything, a woman who paid attention to the world and believed it was worth the effort. It was in the barn the next morning, doing the early work before light, in the same cold he had done the early work in for 4 years, that Caleb finally found the old journal. He had moved a loose board in the tack room to get at a rusted hinge, and behind the board, stuffed there by a version of himself he could barely remember, the version in the first year after Sarah, when the impulse had been to hide everything painful out of sight, was the journal. Brown leather, cracked at the spine, his own handwriting on the first page. He stood in the dark tack room with the journal in his hands and felt the specific weight of something you buried coming back up to the surface. He did not open it. Not then. He tucked it under his arm and finished the morning work and came in for breakfast. And Eliza was at the stove and the coffee was going, and he set the journal on the table where she could see it. She saw it. She looked at him. "I found this," he said, "behind the wall in the tack room." She looked at it without touching it. "Is it yours?" "Yes." She looked at him carefully. "Do you want me to?" "I want you to know it exists," he said. "I don't know what's in it. I wrote it a long time ago, and I haven't been back to it." He stopped. "I think there are things in it I'm going to have to deal with." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When you're ready." "I don't know when that'll be." "I know." She turned back to the stove. "The coffee's done." He sat down at the table. He moved the journal to the side, not hiding it, just out of the way. She put the coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Outside the kitchen window, the March sky was doing the thing it did occasionally at the end of a cold stretch, going a pale and particular shade of blue that was the first real signal, not yet warmth but the rumor of warmth, that something was on its way. Caleb looked at the journal on the table and did not open it. But he did not put it away either, and that was the most honest thing he had done with it in 4 years. The journal sat on the kitchen shelf for 11 days. Caleb had put it there after breakfast that first morning. Not hidden, not prominent, just on the shelf between the tin of salt and the spare lantern wick, where he could see it every time he came in from outside. He did not open it. He was not ready to open it, and he knew he was not ready. And he had enough experience with himself to understand that forcing the thing would not make it go better. Eliza did not touch it. She did not ask about it. She walked past it every day the same way she walked past anything in the house that belonged to him, with the careful respect of someone who understood the difference between sharing a space and owning it. On the 12th day, he took it off the shelf after supper and sat with it at the table. She was across from him with the ledger, adding the week's notes. He set the journal in front of him and looked at the cover for a while without opening it. She kept writing. The stove settled. Outside, the first genuine thaw had started 3 days ago, and the sound of the land releasing itself from winter, the drip of snowmelt, the occasional shift of the ground, had become the background noise of every evening. He opened it. The early entries were from the first months after Sarah died. He had not remembered writing them, but there they were in his own hand, ragged, sometimes barely legible, the writing of a man getting words out fast before he could stop himself. He read them with the same careful distance he would have given to reading about someone else, which was the only way he could read them at all. The grief in them was not something he recognized as belonging to him anymore, and it was also completely familiar, which was a strange thing to hold at the same time. There were entries about the boy, Thomas, who had lived 11 days. He had not let himself think the name in years. It sat in his chest now the way a stone sits. Not sharp, just there, taking up its space honestly. He turned pages. He read in no particular hurry, because the words were going to be there whatever pace he went, and he was done pretending he could outrun them. He had been outrunning them for 4 years, and the ranch had very nearly gone to ruin in the meantime, so the strategy had proven itself insufficient. Eliza had stopped writing. He could feel it without looking up, the specific texture of a room where someone has gone still. He kept reading. After a while he said, without looking up, "There are things in here I don't know what to do with." "You don't have to do anything with them tonight," she said. "No." He turned another page. "But I've been not doing anything with them for 4 years, and I think that's about the limit of how long that works." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are the things?" He looked up. She was watching him, not with the careful blankness people put on when they were trying to seem neutral, but openly, with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered to her. He told her. "Not everything at once. It came in pieces, the way things do when you've been holding them compressed for a long time and they expand on the way out. He told her about the winter Sarah died, which had been a winter like this one in some ways, cold that came fast, the ranch isolated, no way to get the doctor in time. He told her about Thomas, the 11 days, and the specific cruelty of having had something and lost it so fast that the loss was almost larger than the having. He told her about burning the ledger and what it had felt like afterward, which was not relief as he had thought it might be, but a different kind of grief, the grief of having removed the last evidence that those years had happened. He did not cry. He was not made for crying easily, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He spoke with the careful evenness of someone choosing words precisely because the alternative was not to speak at all. She listened. She did not try to fix anything he said, or offer the standard consolations that people offered, which he could not have borne. She listened the way she read the ledger, with real attention, following the thing from beginning to end, not jumping ahead to where she thought it was going. When he stopped, not because he was done, but because he had reached a natural pause, the place where the immediate weight had been spoken, she said, "Thomas." "Yes." "That's a good name," she said. It was the only thing she could have said that was true and useful, and also did not require him to respond to it, and she had found it without trying, and he looked at her across the kitchen table and understood something he had been approaching for months, that Eliza Marlowe had been through enough herself that she knew exactly how to be with someone else's pain without making it worse. "Tell me about your mother," he said. "If you want to." She looked slightly surprised, not that he asked, but that he asked now, in this particular exchange. Then she settled and told him. Her mother had been a practical woman with a good mind and bad luck and health, who had died of a fever when Eliza was 19 and left behind a husband who loved her completely and had no idea how to function without her. Eliza had spent the 3 years after her mother's death effectively running the household while her father went through the money and the property and the connections he had built over 30 years, and she had done it without resentment for a long time. And then with resentment, and then the resentment had hardened into something more complicated when she understood he was not going to recover, and she was going to have to make a life independently, regardless of what she wanted. "I answered the advertisement," she said, "because I had been taking care of something that wasn't going to survive for 3 years, and I don't know exactly how to say this." She looked at the table. "I wanted to take care of something that could." He absorbed this. Outside the thaw was dripping in the dark. "The ranch," he said. "At first," she said, and then she did not add anything to that, but she looked at him, and he looked at her, and what was not said was as present in the room as anything that had been. He closed the journal. He set it on the table. He thought about what it meant to have carried something for 4 years, and then, in the space of a kitchen table on a March evening, to have set part of it down in front of someone and had them not flinch. He thought about what that was worth. He thought he did not have the language for it yet, but he was working on it. April arrived and the East Pasture came to life in the specific, unspectacular way that agricultural recovery came to life, slowly, patchily, in a way that required you to remember what it had looked like before in order to see that something had changed. The drainage was working. Eliza checked it every morning, walking the channel line with the same methodical attention she brought to every part of the ranch. And she came in at mid-morning and updated the ledger, and the entries in April had a different quality from the winter entries. Still precise, still careful, but with an undercurrent of something that was not quite excitement, but was in the same family. Caleb felt it too. There was a particular satisfaction in watching something you had bet everything on begin to deliver, and the East Pasture was delivering. The cover crop she had put in before the last cold snap was establishing. The soil that had tested alkaline was responding to the lime treatment. The drainage channel that he and Garner's foreman and old Denner had rebuilt in the frozen mud of March was performing exactly as her calculation said it should. He told her this one morning while they were checking the fence line. "You were right about the lime," he said, "and the channel angle." She was looking at the fence post she was testing for rot. Felix gets credit for the angle. He saw the modification. "You designed the system." "I designed a version of it. It got improved by people who knew more than I did." She moved to the next post. "That's how things should go." He watched her work the fence with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for months, which she had. Her hands were weathered now in a way they hadn't been in October. There was a competence in the way she moved around the ranch that had nothing performed about it. She was not working to prove anything to anyone anymore, if she ever had been. She was just doing the work because it was her work. Garner's coming in June, he said. If the pasture holds. It'll hold. How sure are you? She looked at him. 80%, she said, which is as sure as I get about anything. He almost smiled. He was doing that more, almost smiling, which was a different category from actually smiling, but was an improvement from the previous 4 years of neither. Hale made his move in the second week of April. It came through the bank, which was exactly where Caleb had expected it to come from once Garner had told him about the county office visit. A letter arrived from Miles City, from a man named Greer, who worked in Aldrich's office, stating that in light of concerns about the viability of the Whitmore property, the bank was requesting a review of the current loan status and inviting Caleb to present himself at the Miles City office by the end of the month. He read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He put it down. Eliza was at the stove. She turned around, saw his face, and came to read it over his shoulder. She finished and stepped back. Hale got to someone in the office, she said. Greer. Has to be Greer. Aldrich himself wouldn't move on a performing loan without more than gossip. He looked at the letter. But Greer can create enough paperwork to make Aldrich look at it. When do we go? He looked at her. I go. It's my loan. It's our ranch, she said. It came out without hesitation, and she did not walk it back, just looked at him steadily. He would think later about that moment, about the ease with which she had said it, and the equal ease with which he had not corrected her. It had simply been true, stated plainly, and that was that. End of the month, he said. Miles City is 2 days' ride. Then we have 2 weeks to prepare what we bring, she said. She was already moving toward the shelf. She took down the ledger. She took down the document she had written during the February storm, the 2-year projection, the structured account of the East Pasture Plan. She set them on the table. We need more than this, she said. We need the soil test records and the cattle health records and the Garner arrangement in writing. She looked at him. Can you write to Garner today? Ask him to put the June arrangement in a letter that we can carry? Caleb looked at everything on the table. He looked at Eliza, who was already in motion, already organizing, already 3 steps into solving the problem with the same focused energy she brought to drainage channels and frozen pumps and sick cattle. Yes, he said, I'll write to Garner today. He wrote to Garner. He wrote to old Denner, too, who had no formal stake in the East Pasture, but whose name on a letter of support from an established valley rancher would carry weight. Eliza wrote a careful, formal summary of the ranch's current condition and its projected output through the end of the year, cross-referenced to the ledger records, so every claim could be verified. She worked on it 3 evenings in a row, and each draft was cleaner and more precise than the last, and Caleb read each version and said what he thought, and she incorporated what made sense and pushed back on what didn't, and they argued about 2 of the projections in the specific productive way of 2 people who were both trying to get at the truth. Garner's reply came in 6 days. It was short in the way Garner did everything, but it was clear. He confirmed the June arrangement and the rate and added, at the bottom in his old careful handwriting, that in 30 years of working the valley he had seen what poor management looked like and what it did to a property, and the Whitmore Ranch was not that. He said Caleb Whitmore was a competent man who had had hard years, and the woman he had brought in knew land better than most men he'd encountered, and together they were doing the kind of work that deserved to be backed. Caleb read this letter several times. Then he gave it to Eliza without comment. She read it. She set it down. She was quiet for a moment. He didn't have to say all that, she said. No, Caleb said. He didn't. She looked at the letter. There was something on her face he had only seen a few times, a brief, unguarded moment before the practical expression came back. 30 years of experience, and he thinks we're doing it right, she said. She stopped. I know, he said. She picked up the draft summary and went back to work. They rode to Miles City on a Tuesday, leaving before dawn to make time, and the 2 days of riding gave them more sustained conversation than they had managed in all of winter. There was something about being on horseback across open country that loosened things. The absence of the ranch's immediate demands, the rhythm of the horses, the particular honesty of a long road. She told him about St. Louis in more detail than she had before. About the neighborhood she had grown up in, which had been respectable and then less so as her father's position declined. About the women she had worked alongside for 3 years in a garment factory, who had taught her more about practical endurance than any book she'd ever read. About the morning she had seen the advertisement in the paper. She had not answered it immediately, she said. She had torn it out and carried it in her coat pocket for 2 weeks before she wrote the letter. "What made you decide?" he asked. She thought about it. "A woman at the factory," she said. She'd been there 15 years, she was 40. And one morning I looked at her and thought, she doesn't dislike her life. She just stopped expecting it to change. She paused. I didn't want to stop expecting things, so I sent the letter. He wrote a few paces with that. "My sister wrote the advertisement," he said. "I didn't know she was doing it." "I know. She told me in her first letter." She glanced at him. "She described you as difficult but worth the effort." He looked at her. "She said that?" "She said you had built walls around yourself the way some men built fences, beyond what the property actually required." She said it without malice. "I thought that was a fair thing to say about someone." "It's accurate," he said, after a moment. "I know," she said. "I've spent 6 months walking around your fences." He did not answer, but he was aware of her on the horse beside him, and of the 6 months she was describing, and of what it had cost her to stay when it would have been easier, by any practical measure, to go. Miles City arrived on the afternoon of the second day. The meeting with Aldrich was set for the morning. They took rooms at the same boarding house. He dropped his bag and went directly to the saloon for a drink. Not from a lack of discipline, but from the simple understanding that a long ride followed by a night before something important required exactly one whiskey, no more, alone. He sat at this bar and drank it and thought about what tomorrow needed to accomplish. A man came and sat one stool over. It took Caleb a moment to place him, younger, with a clerk's pallor and a way of sitting that suggested he spent most of his time at a desk. Greer. He recognized the man from the single visit to the bank 2 years ago, when Greer had handled the paperwork while Aldrich conducted the actual meeting. Their eyes met in the bar mirror. Greer looked away first. He drank his beer quickly and left. Caleb sat with his whiskey and looked at the space where Greer had been. He did not feel what he expected to feel, which was anger. What he felt instead was tired. The tired that comes not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of being in a world where some people spent their energy trying to take things from others rather than building anything themselves. He had known men like Hale his whole life, had known the Greers who worked for them, the small accommodating corruption of people who were not ambitious enough to steal directly but were willing to hold the door. He finished the whiskey. He went to bed early. In the morning he dressed in his good jacket and went downstairs and found Eliza already at the breakfast table, composed and organized with the leather satchel that held their documents on the chair beside her. She had put her hair up in a way she didn't usually bother with, and her expression had the particular focused quality of someone who had been preparing for something and was ready for it. She looked at him when he sat down. "Did you sleep?" "Enough," he said. She pushed the coffee toward him. "Aldrich is a practical man, you said." "Yes." "Then the documents will do what they need to do." "Yes," he said again. They ate breakfast and walked to the bank. Aldrich turned out to be a man in his 60s with the settled manner of someone who had been in the lending business long enough to have developed reliable instincts. He sat behind his desk and looked at what they had brought: the ledger, the soil records, the cattle health documentation, the Garner letter, the Denner letter, Eliza's 2-year projection, and he looked at it with the genuine attention of someone reading something rather than performing reading. Greer sat in the corner of the room throughout. He said nothing. After 20 minutes, Aldrich looked up. "Who prepared the projection?" he said. "Miss Marlowe," Caleb said. Aldrich looked at Eliza. "Your method for the alkalinity calculation? You're using Hendrix's framework?" Eliza looked slightly surprised. "Yes. Do you know his work?" "My daughter is a botanist in Philadelphia. She's been trying to get ranchers in Montana to pay attention to soil chemistry for years." He looked back at the projection. "This is solid work." He set the papers down. "Mr. Whitmore, the inquiry to this office came through a third party whose interests in your property are not, shall we say, neutral. I've been aware of that since the letter was submitted." Caleb looked at him carefully. "But you called the review anyway." "Because I have obligations to my institution, and when a formal inquiry arrives I cannot ignore it. But an inquiry requires investigation, not predetermined conclusions. He looked at the Garner letter. Emmett Garner has been banking with this institution for 25 years. When Emmett Garner writes that a property is well run, I take that at face value. He looked at both of them. Your loan is not at risk, Mr. Whitmore. I'll put that in writing today. If anyone asks this office about the status of your account, the answer will be accurate. Caleb let out a breath that he had been holding since the letter arrived 2 weeks ago, or perhaps longer than that. Eliza beside him said nothing, but he felt the small shift in her posture that meant the same thing. I'd like to discuss refinancing the existing terms, Caleb said. The East Pasture is going to be producing at a rate that changes the financial picture. I'd like to hear about that, Aldrich said. They were in the office for another hour. When they came out, the late morning sun was on the main street of Miles City, and the air was warm in the genuine way of a spring that had finally committed. Eliza squinted in the light. He's going to refinance, she said. Lower rate, Caleb said. Not dramatically, but enough. She nodded. She was holding the satchel against her side. He could tell she was processing, going back through the conversation, cataloging it, figuring out what it meant for the ledger's projections. The Greer situation, she said. He'll report back to Hale that it didn't work, Caleb said. Hale will find another angle. He always does. But not this one. Not this one. She looked out at the street. We should get the horses. If we start by noon, we can cover good ground before dark. We could stay another night, he said. The road back is fine in either direction. She looked at him. It was an offer, and she knew it. Not just of another day of riding time, but of the particular suspended quality of being away from the ranch, away from the daily demands, in the relative freedom of unfamiliar territory. All right, she said, another night. They walked toward the livery. She had left 2 inches between them on the bank steps, and she did not close it, but she did not increase it either, and that was its own kind of language. That evening, they ate in the boarding house dining room rather than separately, which was its own small statement. The food was ordinary, the kind of meal that existed primarily to fill a person up rather than to be experienced. But there was wine, which neither of them drank much of, and both of them had a glass of. And the conversation moved differently than it did at the ranch kitchen table, looser somehow, with less weight. She told him about the garment factory in more detail than she had on the road. He told her things about his time before the ranch, the years after the war when he had worked cattle in Texas, the period of deliberate wandering before he found the Montana property, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was looking at a piece of land that he wanted to stay on. How did you know? She asked. It looked like work I could do for the rest of my life, he said. Not work I had to do. Work like I wanted to. She was quiet for a moment. Is it still that? He looked at her across the table. More than it used to be, he said. She looked down at her wine. She turned the glass slightly. He watched her decide something. He could see it, the small, visible moment of a person arriving at the edge of something and choosing whether to step. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to tell me the truth, not what you think I need to hear. All right, he said. She looked at him directly. What are we doing with... She paused. With the arrangement, as it is now. She held his gaze. I came here on specific terms, and those terms have shifted. I want to understand what they've shifted to, from your perspective, because I find that I'm operating as though I know, and I don't actually know. He was quiet for a moment. It was the most direct she had ever been about the thing neither of them had been talking about, and it deserved a direct answer, and he was trying to find the one that was true without being more than he could stand behind. I came to the station in October, he said, to tell you there had been a mistake and send you back. I know. And I didn't. He looked at his hands on the table. I didn't because you got off the train and stood there the way you did, and something... He stopped. He was not practiced at this, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. I have been trying to keep a certain distance, he said, from you and from what I think is happening, because I've lost people and I know what that costs, and I made a decision after Sarah that I wasn't going to be in a position to lose someone again. She was listening without expression. I don't think, he said, that the decision is working anymore. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the dining room, the sounds of Miles City at night went on. Horses, voices, the particular loose noise of a town that had not quite settled down. "I'm not planning to go anywhere," she said. It was not a declaration. It was a simple, level statement of intent. "I know," he said. "That's partly what's making it harder to keep the distance." She looked at him. Then something happened on her face that he had not seen before. Not quite a smile, but the thing that existed just before one, the softening of everything that had been held tight. "That's an honest answer," she said. "You asked for one." "I did." She looked at her wine. "We can let it be what it's becoming," she said, "without forcing it to be named before it's ready." "Yes," he said, "that's what I'd like." They finished dinner. They said good night in the hall, in the careful way of two people who were in the process of renegotiating the terms of their careful ways. And he went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the conversation with more clarity than he'd thought about anything personal in years. She was not planning to go anywhere. He was not planning to keep the distance. Those two facts together made a shape he recognized, and the shape was not frightening the way he had expected it to be. It was, and he turned this over several times because it was unfamiliar, it was something more like relief. The ride back to the ranch took 2 days and arrived on a Friday afternoon in late April when the east pasture was doing exactly what Eliza's projections said it should be doing. He stood at the fence line with her the evening they got back, both of them still trail dusty, and they looked at it together. The cover crop was thick and even. The drainage channel was running clean from the snowmelt that was still coming off the mountains. The soil had the particular dark quality of ground that was active and responding. "June is going to be fine," she said. "Better than fine," he said. She looked at it for another moment. Then she turned and walked toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and there was no gap between them on the path back. Not the 2 inches from the bank steps, not the respectful distances they had maintained through winter. They walked as people walk when they have stopped performing distance for each other. Inside, the kitchen was exactly as they had left it, the ledger on the shelf. The soil sample jars still lined up, though they had been there long enough that they were reference now rather than current data. The journal on the shelf beside the salt, where he had put it the morning after he opened it. She put the satchel down and went to the stove. He hung up his coat. He went to the shelf and picked up the journal, not to read it, but just to hold it for a moment, the way you hold something when you are deciding what to do with it. He set it back on the shelf. Not hidden, just there. "I'll get the stove," he said. "I'll start supper," she said. They moved around this kitchen with the practiced ease of 7 months of shared work, and the kitchen filled with warmth. And outside the east pasture held what they had built through the worst of winter and the long effort of spring, and there was more work ahead. There was always more work ahead. But for the first time in 4 years, Caleb Whitmore looked at the work ahead and did not see it as the thing that kept him from falling into the empty space where his life used to be. He saw it as the thing he was building toward. That was a different thing entirely, and he knew the difference, and it had a great deal to do with the woman across the kitchen who was making supper and keeping records, and had told him plainly that she was not planning to go anywhere. He put the wood in the stove and lit it, and the fire caught. June came the way good things sometimes come after a long wait, not with fanfare, but quietly, as if it had simply decided it was time. The east pasture produced. Not spectacularly, not in the way of stories where the harvest is golden and abundant, and everyone stands at the fence line with their hands on their hips looking satisfied. It produced the way real things produce when real work has been put into them, adequately, solidly, with enough margin to matter. The cover crop had done what Eliza said it would do. The drainage channel ran clean through the wet weeks of May. The soil that had been alkaline and resistant came back with the amendment, not all at once but enough, in the sections where they had concentrated the lime treatment, to make the difference between a pasture that was recovering and one that was failing. Garner's cattle came through in the second week of June. His foreman, Felix, rode point, and Garner himself came for the first day and walked the new route with Caleb and said very little, but looked at everything with the assessing eyes of a man who knew what he was assessing. At the end of the walk, he said the route was sound, and the pasture was better managed than he had expected, and the rate they had agreed on was fair. He said it to Caleb, but he said it loud enough that Eliza, who was at the fence 20 feet away, could hear. Caleb thought that was deliberate. He thought Garner was not as uncomplicated as he presented himself. The Garner cattle moved through over 4 days. The payment came by bank draft the following week, and Caleb carried it to Miles City himself and handed it to Aldrich's office as the June installment on the loan. Greer was not at his desk when he came in, which was either coincidence or the instinct of a man who knew when to be elsewhere. Aldrich himself handled the transaction, stamped it recorded, and said the account was in good standing. Caleb rode home with the receipt in his jacket pocket and the particular lightness of a man who has carried a specific weight for a long time and has just set it down on something solid. Hale made one more attempt. It was in July, and it was the most direct thing he had done, which suggested he was running out of indirect options. He came to the property. He rode up the main track on a Saturday morning when the summer work was in full swing, and he came with two of his hired men behind him, which was the kind of entrance designed to make a statement about relative size and power. Caleb saw him coming from the far fence and walked in from the pasture without hurrying. Eliza came out of the house when she heard the horses. She stood on the porch. Hale looked at her first, which was the tell, the instinctive move of a man who had decided she was the weak point in this situation, and was still operating on that assessment, despite the evidence of 8 months to the contrary. "Whitmore," Hale said, pulling up his horse. "I'll make this simple. The east pasture and the water rights. I'm prepared to make a fair offer." Caleb stopped at the gate. "I'm not selling." "You haven't heard the number." "Doesn't matter." Hale looked at him. He looked at Eliza on the porch. He looked back at Caleb with the expression of a man who is recalculating and does not like where the calculation is landing. "Your loan situation is settled," Caleb said. "Aldrich's office can confirm it." A pause. The two hired men behind Hale did not move, but their horses shifted, which was the animal equivalent of an awkward silence. "The woman," Hale started. "Her name is Miss Marlowe," Caleb said. His voice was even. "And whatever you're about to say about her, I'd think twice." Hale looked at him for a long moment. He was doing the particular calculation of a bully who has found that the leverage he counted on does not exist, looking for a new angle and not finding one. His face went through several expressions before it settled on the one that men like him settled on when they had no remaining move. Contempt performed as dignity. "You're making a mistake," Hale said. "I've made plenty," Caleb said. "This isn't one of them." Hale turned his horse and rode back out. His men followed. The hoofbeats faded down the track, and then there was just the summer sound of the ranch, the cattle in the far pasture, the wind in the grass, the ordinary persistent noise of a working piece of land. Caleb turned around. Eliza was still on the porch. She had her arms crossed, and her expression was the careful neutral of someone who had been listening closely and was now deciding what to do with what she had heard. He walked to the porch and stopped at the bottom step. "He won't come back," he said. "Not directly. He might try other things, but not this." "I know," she said. She paused. "You said this isn't a mistake." "I did." She looked at him. "Were you talking about the ranch?" He held her gaze. "Not entirely," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with the direct, undeflected attention she had given him from the first day on the platform. The look that had no performance in it, that simply saw what it was looking at. Then she nodded once, the small, decisive nod of someone who has received information they intended to do something about, and went back inside. He stood at the bottom of the porch step for a moment in the July sun. Then he went back to the fence work, because the fence work did not wait, and some things were better approached from a slight distance before they were approached directly. It was Margaret who finally said what needed to be said, which was appropriate since she was the one who had started the whole thing. She came in August for a second visit, announced this time with only 4 days' notice instead of 2 weeks, which Caleb suspected was intentional. She was checking in rather than staging an arrival. She came on a Wednesday and found them both in the middle of the late summer work, which meant she saw the ranch as it actually operated rather than as it was when company was expected. She stayed 3 days. She walked the east pasture with Eliza on the first afternoon and came in for supper with mud on her boots and a look on her face that Caleb recognized as the look she wore when she was satisfied about something she had done. She was not subtle about the satisfaction and did not try to be. On the second evening, while Eliza was in the barn doing the last animal check, Margaret sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table with her tea and said, without preamble, "When are you going to ask her?" He looked at his coffee. "Margaret." "I'm not pushing," she said, which was what she always said. I'm asking a practical question. It's been 10 months. The ranch is clearly a shared enterprise. She is clearly... She stopped, looked for the right word. She is clearly not going anywhere. And you are clearly... I know what I am, he said. Then what are you waiting for? He thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was complicated and had several layers, and he had spent the summer slowly working through them the way you work through ground that has been compacted, carefully, with appropriate tools, without forcing it. I want to do it right, he said. Not because of obligation or practicality. I want her to know that it's... He stopped. That it's a real thing, Margaret said. Yes. She looked at him with the particular expression of an older sister who has watched a younger brother be stubborn his whole life and is now watching him try to stop. Caleb, she said, I know you want to be certain before you speak. That's who you are. But she's been certain for quite a while, I think. You're the one who needed time. He looked at his coffee. She doesn't strike me, Margaret said more gently, as a woman who is going to push you. But she has been patient a long time already. He thought about October on the platform, and February in the storm, and March with the journal, and the night in Miles City, when she had said plainly, I'm not planning to go anywhere, and then let it be. He thought about 8 months of watching someone pour themselves into a piece of land, and a life, and a fractured, difficult man, with no guarantee of what they were going to get back. Margaret was right. She had been patient a long time. He went to the barn after Margaret went to bed. Eliza was finishing with the horses. She turned when he came in and read his face the way she read everything, quickly, accurately, without making it obvious she was doing it. Is Margaret all right? She said. She's fine, he said. She went to bed. He stood in the barn with the lantern light and the smell of hay and horses, which was the smell of every important conversation he had apparently had in the last year. And he looked at Eliza and decided that he had done enough preparation and enough waiting and enough protecting himself from the thing he had already decided. I want to ask you something, he said. She set down the brush. She turned to face him fully. I'm not a simple man, he said. I know that. I have gaps in me, from the years and from what I've lost, and I don't know that all of them fill in completely. I want you to know that I know that about myself. She was very still. But I also know, he said, that this ranch is more alive than it has been in 6 years, and that my life is more present than it has been since Sarah died, and that both of those things are because of you. Because of the specific person you are, and the way you came here and stayed and did the work and didn't leave when it would have been reasonable to leave. He stopped. He was not practiced at this, and he was not going to perform a polish he didn't have. I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because of the arrangement we came in on, not for the ranch, because I want you to be my wife, and I should have been clear about moving toward that for the last 3 months, but I was still being careful. She looked at him for a long moment. The horses breathed, the lantern held. You're asking me now, she said. Yes. Not because Margaret is here and you felt pressured. I was going to ask before she arrived, he said. She just removed the last excuse I was using to wait. Something happened on her face. The full version of that thing he had seen the edge of in Miles City. The almost smile that was actually something larger than a smile. Something that had relief in it, and recognition, and the specific exhaustion of a person who has been hoping for something for a long time and has just found out that the hoping was warranted. Yes, she said. It was the same way she said most important things, simply, without decoration. He let out a breath. She stepped toward him and he met her halfway, and it was not graceful. He was a large man who had not embraced anyone with intention in 4 years, and she had her arms at an angle that required adjustment, and they sorted it out in the practical way they sorted out most things. He held her in the lantern-lit barn with his chin at the top of her head and her hands at his back, and it was not a perfect moment. It was a real one, which was better. They married in September. Margaret came back for it, with her husband and the youngest of her 3 children, and Garner came, which surprised Caleb, and which he suspected had been arranged by Margaret through some channel he had not been aware of. The Denners came, Old Man Denner, and Ira's mother, who brought a dish of food that fed everyone twice over. A few other people from the valley came, people who had been watching the Whitmore ranch's year with varying degrees of investment, and had arrived at opinions they were now expressing through attendance. Cora Sims did not come. Hale certainly did not. Greer was in Miles City and presumably had no idea and would not have been welcome regardless. The ceremony was simple. They stood under the cottonwood trees at the east edge of the property. Eliza's choice, because the cottonwood stood near the drainage channel and the east pasture that had come back, which made them, in her view, the most honest possible location. A justice of the peace came from town and said the necessary words. Caleb and Eliza said the words back. Margaret cried briefly and with dignity. Ira Denner looked moved in the way of young men who are encountering something genuine and do not quite have the framework for it yet. Afterward, while people ate and talked in the afternoon light, Caleb stood for a moment at the fence line alone, looking at the east pasture. He was thinking about the year, the whole of it, from October on the platform to this September afternoon. And he was thinking about what it had required of him and what it had given back and the ratio between those two things. He had been wrong about the ratio. He had spent 4 years operating on the assumption that the cost of caring about something was always approximately equal to the pain of losing it, and therefore the rational position was not to care about things. The math had seemed sound. The conclusion had been wrong. What he understood now, standing at the fence in September with his wife 30 feet behind him talking to Margaret, was that the math only worked if you assumed loss was the inevitable outcome. If you stopped assuming that, if you allowed that some things, some people, some pieces of deliberately worked ground could hold and grow and be different in 3 years than they were in 1, then the calculation came out differently. The cost of caring was still real. The loss was still possible. He knew that in his body, the way you know things that have actually happened to you. But the alternatives, the 4 years of careful non-investment, the burned ledger, the walls built further out than the property required, that had a cost too. And it was not a smaller cost. It was a different shape of loss, the loss of your own days spent in a diminished version of yourself. Eliza had not fixed him. He wanted to be clear about that, even in his own understanding of things. She had not arrived and healed him and made him whole. She had arrived and stayed and worked alongside him and been honest with him and refused to leave. And in the course of that, he had started doing the work of healing himself that he had been postponing for 4 years. The difference mattered. She had not saved him. She had been present while he remembered how. He heard her come to stand beside him. He had learned to hear her footstep on any ground. Garner is asking Margaret about the drainage system, she said. She's improvising answers. He almost laughed. How is she doing? Impressively, considering. She stood beside him at the fence, both of them looking at the pasture. What are you thinking about? The year, he said. Good things or hard things? Both, he said. Mostly how they turned out to be the same things. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about next spring, she said. If we extend the channel another 40 feet north, we open up the section that's been too wet to use for 3 years. Felix said a lot of things. Felix was right about the angle. Yes, he said. He was. She looked at the north section. He could see her planning. The specific quality of her attention when she was building something in her head, which he had learned to recognize in the same way he had learned to recognize everything about her, which was slowly and then all at once. It would be a good winter project, she said. The planning, at least. The groundwork in March. March, he repeated, because that worked so well last time. It worked, she said. It was hard and it worked. That's the normal outcome of things done in March in Montana. He looked at her. She was looking at the pasture with the patient, slightly stubborn expression of a woman who had decided what the north section was going to be and was simply waiting for the timeline to catch up. He had learned that expression. He trusted it. All right, he said. March. Margaret called from near the cottonwoods. Something about the food, about people waiting. They turned from the fence together and walked back toward the group, toward the afternoon light, and the voices, and the ordinary, remarkable fact of a life that had people in it again. In the years that came after, the Whitmore Ranch became the kind of property that people in the valley pointed to when they were explaining what a well-run operation looked like. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, but consistently producing, year over year, with the particular reliability that comes from a place where the decisions are made carefully and the records are kept and the failures are documented honestly alongside the successes, so that no year has to start entirely from scratch. Eliza's ledger filled up and was followed by a second and then a third. The soil charts expanded into a system that other ranchers in the valley eventually asked to look at, which she showed them without making anything of it, the same way she had always done things, because it was useful, and usefulness was its own justification. Young Ira Denner came to work the ranch in his second year and stayed for 4, and learned more from watching Eliza work a problem than he had from most of his formal schooling, which he told her once, and which she deflected with characteristic efficiency. Garner ran cattle through the east route every summer. He and Caleb did not become close friends. They were too alike in their self-containment for that. But they became something more durable, which was 2 men who had decided to trust each other and acted accordingly. Hale sold his property in 1885 to a cattle consortium from the east and left the valley without ceremony. Caleb heard about it from the miller, mentioned it to Eliza over supper, and they both acknowledged it with the mild interest you give news that has become less relevant than it once was, and moved on to the question of the north section fence. The rooms of the house stopped feeling empty. There was a child by 1884, a daughter, born in November, who arrived with the same stubbornness of timing as everything else in Montana, and was healthy and loud and regarded the world from her first days with an expression of alert assessment that Caleb recognized with a feeling he did not have adequate words for. They named her Clara. She was not a replacement for Thomas. Caleb was clear in himself about that, and he held both things at once, in the way he had learned to hold things that coexisted without canceling each other out. Clara was herself, entirely, and she was also evidence that the future was real and worth investing in. He took the journal down from the shelf the winter Clara was born. He sat at the kitchen table with it, alone, in the early morning quiet before the house woke up, and read it all the way through. He did not burn it this time. He put it in the box where they kept the things that mattered. Eliza's first soil chart, the Garner letter from the bank review, the receipt from the first loan payment made after the east pasture produced. The things that told the story of how the place had been and what it had become. He put the journal in the box because it was part of the story too, the part where he had been broken and had not known how to stop being broken, and had kept the ranch alive through 4 hard years by sheer stubbornness, which was not nothing. The grief in those pages was real. The isolation was real. He was not going to pretend it hadn't happened, but it was one part of a longer story, and the longer story was different, and the difference had not arrived by accident. Here is what he believed by the end of it, not the triumphant end, because lives don't end triumphantly. They simply continue until they don't, but by the point where the story had found its shape. He believed that the hardest thing a person can do after loss is not to survive. Surviving is hard, but it is a narrow thing. It is the minimum, the floor. The hardest thing is to agree to invest again. To put something of yourself into a person or a place or a project with the full knowledge that it could be taken from you because you have already learned by direct experience that it can. To choose exposure anyway. Not because you are certain of the outcome, but because the alternative, the careful half-life of a person who has decided never to be at risk again, is its own kind of diminishment, slow and nearly invisible, but real. Eliza had known this. She had known it when she tore the advertisement out of the paper and carried it in her pocket for 2 weeks. She had known it when she got off the train in Red Willow with one satchel and stood her ground while Denton Hale shouted at her and looked for the man she'd come to meet. She had known it through the hard winter and the sick cattle and the drainage channel and the March mud and the Miles City Bank meeting and all the slow, careful work of 2 people learning to trust each other without a map. She had not known it would work. She had bet on it anyway. That was the distinction that mattered. Not certainty, but the willingness to act on incomplete information in the direction of something worth having. Caleb understood this in himself by the time Clara was old enough to walk the fence line with him, her small hand in his, asking questions about the cattle and the soil and the water table with the relentless curiosity of a child who had grown up watching 2 adults take the world seriously. He understood that he had been, for 4 years, a man who had decided the information was too incomplete to act on, and that Eliza's arrival had not changed the information. The information was still incomplete. It always would be. What had changed was his willingness to act on it anyway. He told Eliza this once, on an evening in the fall when Clara was asleep, and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp going, the same table where so many things had been said, and not said, and eventually said. He told her in the plain way he had learned to say things after the years of practice. She listened to the whole of it. Then she said, I knew that about you, early on. What did you know? That you weren't a man who had stopped caring. You were a man who had decided caring was too dangerous. She looked at him. Those aren't the same thing. A man who has stopped caring can't be reached. A man who has decided it's dangerous is just waiting for evidence to the contrary. He looked at her across the table. And were you the evidence? I was trying to be, she said. I wasn't sure it would work. It worked, he said. Yes. She looked at the lamp. It did. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did. Immense and cold and indifferent to the specific human business happening in the lit windows of a ranch house that had been grief and was now something else entirely. The cattle were settled, the east pasture held. The ledger was on the shelf with the current year's records, waiting for tomorrow's entry. In the small room down the hall, Clara slept the uncomplicated sleep of a child, who had never known the house as empty, who had always known it as a place where two people worked hard and spoke honestly and stayed. That was what they had built. Not a myth, not a triumph, not a story where everything came right and no one carried scars. A real place, with real ground under it, that had been worked back from the edge by two imperfect people who had bet on each other when neither of them was certain, and had turned out to be right. The lamp burned on. The night held. Caleb Whitmore, who had once driven to a train station to tell a woman there had been a mistake, reached across the kitchen table and covered his wife's hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on, and that was enough. It was, in the end, more than enough.